This is the story of 2-year-old Samara Smith, a little girl whose life was cut tragically short in March 2013. It's a case that involves domestic disturbances. You have child issues, drug use, and ultimately the death of an innocent child who should have been protected by the very people entrusted with her care. But before we begin, I want to warn you, this case involves graphic descriptions. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. To understand this case, we need to first understand the complicated family dynamics at play. Samara Smith was just 2 years old when she died. Her mother, Jill Smith, was in jail in March 2013, leaving her children in a precarious situation. Jill had 7 total children. I don't even have 7 friends. And when she was arrested, she was actually pregnant with her 7th child. Now, the father of this unborn baby was Edward Benesch, a man who would become central to our story today. Edward wasn't Samara's biological father, that was Edward Mays. He too was in jail. But when Jill was incarcerated, Edward stepped in as the primary caregiver for Samara. So to break it down, Jill is pregnant. Edward is the father of the current baby. The victim, Samara, is the child of Edward Mays. Edward is looking after Samara and another 3-year-old sister of Samara. Now, you might think this sounds like a man stepping up to help children in need, but as we'll see, the reality was far more sinister. Edward was living with his sister, Shara Tisdale. They lived in a mobile home on Rocky Road in Dixon County, Tennessee. This home was described as being a pretty good ways out of town, taking at least 10 to 15 minutes to reach downtown Dixon. This isolation would prove significant as events unfolded. Now, Shara's boyfriend, Shannon Edmondson, was also a frequent visitor to the home, staying there on and off. By all accounts from family members, Edward seemed to care for the children. His sister Shara would later testify Edward loved the 2 girls very much, and that she had never noticed bad behavior from him. She even said Edward had cared for her own daughter and other friends' children without any problems. But there were warning signs that perhaps should have been heeded. Now, on March the 6th, 2013, it started like many other evenings at the Rocky Road mobile home. Shara Tisdale had some girlfriends over for what was supposed to be a sleepover. Shannon Edmondson was there too, along with Edward and the 2 little girls. That evening, Shara gave both children a bath and got them ready for bed, a normal routine that included putting on their pajamas. During this time, she noticed Samara had what appeared to be a chew mark above her ear from the previous week, but otherwise the child appeared to be fine. No other marks, no visible injuries. But plans changed that evening. One of Shara's friends received a phone call from her niece asking her to babysit. So the group decided to abandon their sleepover plans and head back to Dixon to stay at the niece's house instead. This decision would prove to be fateful. So around 10 p.m., Shara and her 2 friends and Shannon Edmondson left the mobile home. They dropped Shannon off at his mother's house and the women continued on their destination. This left Edward alone with 2-year-old Samara and her 3-year-old sister. According to Shara's testimony, when they left, Edward was awake and he was playing with the 2 girls. She also stated that she hadn't seen Edward drinking or using drugs that evening, and that if Edward was around children, he wouldn't drink to excess. But other witnesses would paint a very different picture of Edward's condition that day. What happened next in that mobile home would only be known through testimony of one key witness. That was a neighbor named John Rayburn. John lived next door to the mobile home and testified that he visited Edward on the evening of March 6th. And according to Rayburn, when he arrived, Samara and her sister were there, along with what was described as a white man and a black man. What Rayburn claimed to witness that evening was deeply disturbing. He testified that he observed Edward drinking beer and snorting cocaine while the children were present. But far worse than the substance was what Rayburn said he witnessed next. According to his testimony, at some point during the evening, the 3-year-old sister took off Samara's sock and the little girl lost it. This seemingly minor incident sent Edward in a rage. Rayburn testified Edward became angry about the sock. He touched Samara like a man, striking her 3 times in the rib and in the head. Eddie, you silly bastard. The violence didn't stop there. Edward then threw the 2-year-old into a closet. Rayburn said that Samara cried after Edward did this, and when asked how long she cried, he replied she cried all the time he was there. He estimated he was only inside Edward's house for about 10 minutes that evening, but those few minutes would haunt him. During this visit, Edward also allegedly expressed his frustration at the entire situation, telling Rayburn he was tired of caring for 2 girls, while their mother was incarcerated and couldn't wait until Jill was released from jail. And after witnessing this violence against the toddler, Rayburn left the residence. Critically though, he didn't immediately report what he saw. He would only do so the following morning after speaking with both his mother and his wife. Now it's important to note, Edward's sister Shara and her boyfriend Shannon would later dispute part of Rayburn's account. They testified that they only seen Rayburn at the residence maybe once or twice the entire time they lived there, and Shannon specifically denied being present with Rayburn on the evening of March 6th. However, Rayburn was shown photographs and identified both Shannon and Jonathan Lane as the 2 men he saw that evening, claiming he had seen them multiple times. And while the witness accounts varied, there was physical evidence that supported claims of Edward's substance abuse that day. Earlier, on March 6th, around 12 p.m., a woman named Cherish Silvis testified that Edward had visited her home to see her boyfriend. When she saw Edward, she thought he might have been messed up on drugs, possibly cocaine. Shannon, despite denying being present during the alleged abuse, had given a statement to police saying Edward appeared to have been drinking or was messed up earlier in the day. And most damning was the physical evidence found later. See, during the investigation of the mobile home, law enforcement discovered a plastic drinking straw with powdery residue in Edward's bedroom. Testing by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation revealed the presence of cocaine and human DNA on the straw that matched Edward's DNA profile. Edward, oh Eddie, why are you taking hard drugs in front of children? You classless bastard. There was also surveillance footage from a Love's Travel Center off I-40 that showed Edward inside the store around 11 p.m. purchasing a 6-pack of beer and a pack of cigarettes. This was after the alleged mistreatment of the children had taken place, and after he claimed to be too intoxicated to drive. Now the next morning would bring the tragic conclusion to this story. So 7 a.m., March 7th, 2013, Edward arrived at the home of Kimberly Perez. Kimberly is Samara's aunt. Kimberly was asleep on her couch when Edward woke her up, telling her Samara is sick, she needs to go to the hospital. Kimberly instructed Edward to bring Samara inside. She went to use the restroom. When she returned to the living room, Edward was at the door with Samara on his shoulder. What Kimberly saw next would haunt her forever. When she took Samara and Edward and laid her on the floor, the little girl was limp and unresponsive. Kimberly tried to arouse Samara by talking to her and touching her, but she quickly realized the child was not breathing. Kimberly described Samara's condition, that she wasn't moving, her eyes had rolled back when she put her down, and they were kind of like half open. Knowing something was terribly wrong, Kimberly immediately called 911 and began performing CPR on Samara while receiving instructions from the emergency operator. But Edward's behavior in these crucial moments was quite telling. According to Kimberly, Edward immediately left her home after handing Samara over to her. He had just brought Samara's 3-year-old sister with him, leaving her with Kimberly as well. Kimberly said Edward left in a hurry because she could hear gravel spinning everywhere in her driveway. This sounded like someone fleeing a scene. And when Kimberly later spoke with investigators, she recalled Edward's explanation for what happened. According to a statement she gave, Edward had told her that he tripped and fell on top of Samara the night before, and he noticed she was wheezing late at night. When Kimberly asked him, well, why didn't you call 911? He said, because I was scared. Now, emergency personnel and law enforcement responded quickly. to Kimberly's 911 call about the child who was not breathing. When Officer Scott Anthony Hall within the City of Dixon Police Department arrived, what he found was a scene that will stay with him for the rest of his career. Officer Hull saw Samara lying on a blanket in the living room. He checked for a pulse and signs of breathing, but found none. His description of Samara's condition was heartbreaking. He said, "When I walked in, she was facing her head towards the TV. Her feet were towards the crib. Behind one of her ears was a large knot. She had marks all over her abdominal cavity, on her sides, her back. She had deep purple marks. She was lifeless." Officer Hull took over CPR from Kimberly, but his efforts would prove futile. When he saw emergency vehicles arriving, he carried Samara outside to continue CPR, but then brought her back inside to keep her warm. Throughout these efforts, he noticed Samara was already rigid, and that she was limp like a normal child would not be. Outside in the daylight, the extent of Samara's injuries became even more apparent. He testified that the marks were more extreme than what he thought they were initially. Then you had paramedic Heather Bradley from the Dixon County Ambulance Service. When she arrived, Samara was unresponsive, cold to the touch, and pulseless. Bradley noticed multiple marks on Samara's head, face, chest, back, legs, and arms. The emergency responders attempted to use an automated external defibrillator, but the device did not detect a heartbeat. No shock was advised, no further resuscitation attempts were performed, and based on the condition of the child and the lack of any signs consistent with life, a doctor pronounced Samara dead at the scene. Bradley characterized the marks on Samara's body as significant. Now, while emergency responders were fighting to save Samara's life, law enforcement was already looking for Edward. That same morning, Officer Jerry Booker went to Edward's home on Rocky Road. He knocked on the door. No one answered. However, Officer Booker noticed something unusual. While standing at Edward's front door, he could smell a typical household cleaner smell. It was a little stronger than what you would expect. This detail would prove significant during the investigation. Edward himself was ultimately found at the home of Judith Lane on Dowdy Road and was arrested. Interestingly, Edward's vehicle was found quite a ways away from the Dowdy Road residence, abandoned and unattended in a Kmart store parking lot. When he was arrested, his first words were telling. He said, "Is the girl okay? I was just about to call you. Were you bollocks?" Now, in the hours leading up to his arrest, Edward had been busy trying to construct an alibi to cover his tracks. Early that morning, Edward had sent several text messages to his sister Shara. The messages showed his growing panic. First he said, "Call me now." Then he said, "The baby is hurt." Then he said, "Pick up the phone. The baby is hurt bad." But the most damning message was, "If anybody asks, I've not had the kids in 2 days. I've been with you." What a muppet to text messages, huh? This message clearly showed Edward's consciousness of guilt and his attempt to create an alibi. Edward also called Judith that morning around 7 a.m., asking her for a ride because his car had broken down. When Judith picked him up at a local Kroger's, Edward told her his version of events. According to Judith's testimony, Edward said there was something wrong with Samara. He told her he had fallen down the steps and fell on Samara the night before, and that he thought she was okay because she cried for a bit, but then she was fine. And he said she went to bed and everything was okay. Then the next morning, he felt like something was wrong with Samara. He took Samara and her sister to Miss Perez's house. Judith described Edward's demeanor as scared and quiet. He said he looked scared, really quiet. He was really quiet. He was direct and to the point. He didn't say a whole lot of extra stuff. In a later statement to investigators, Edward would elaborate on this story, claiming he was coming down the steps to go to the store, had Samara in his arms, when a cat ran underneath his foot, causing him to trip and fall down the steps onto the child. Now, this obviously doesn't explain all her other injuries, but Muppet people will conduct in Muppet behavior and come up with Muppet lies. Now, when investigators arrived at the Rocky Road mobile home to conduct their search, they found evidence that painted a very different picture than Edward's fall story. Agent Mike Breedlove, who was leading the investigation, observed several key pieces of evidence. There was a reddish-brown stain or substance on the front steps of the mobile home, along with a scuff mark or something on one of the steps, and fibers of hair on the floor mat on the porch. Inside the home, investigators found the cocaine residue straw in Edward's bedroom, but they also noticed that their mobile home appeared to have been cleaned. Agent Breedlove testified that while the home was in general disarray, there was evidence that there was some cleaning done. He could smell some kind of cleaning agents and saw a bucket with a mop and a cleaning agent inside. Significantly, there was no beer bottles or cigarettes found anywhere inside the residence, despite surveillance footage showing Edward had purchased these items the night before. The investigators also learned Samara may have occasionally slept on an air mattress, and while witnesses had seen 2 air mattresses in the home, none were found during the search. Even more telling, investigators found a pair of matching children's socks, one in the laundry area and another behind a white rocker. This corroborated John Rayburn's testimony about the lost sock that triggered Edward. Imagine that, getting triggered over a sock. Muppet. Agent Breedlove also noted there was a reddish-brown stain or substance in the trash can, even though the can was otherwise empty. During his interview with law enforcement, Edward's story then began to fall apart. See, in a recorded interview, Edward made several damaging admissions. He revealed he knew Samara was messed up bad when she was injured. He admitted that he believed she needed to go to the hospital at the time. He acknowledged that he didn't take her to the hospital that evening due to the level of his intoxication, and most contradictory to his claims of being too drunk to drive, he admitted after the fall he still went to the gas station to get cigarettes. So you can go buy a nicotine stick, but you can't take her to the hospital. Moron. Furthermore, Edward's own words about his guilt. See, during the interview he said, "A little girl is dead. It's all my fault. Man, it's my motherfucking fault. I wish I had been a good man. I was trying to keep them safe." He also said, "Being charged with murdering a kid is like my baby. It's mine. We were so close. The mother is pregnant with my baby. I killed her kid. I killed her, man. She's pregnant with my baby. I can't believe she's dead, man." And the agent, while he was rambling, the agent noted that Edward was under quite a bit of distress. Now, the autopsy, performed by Dr. Thomas Deering, revealed the horrific extent of Samara's injuries and definitively proved this was no accident. This was not a fall. Since the doctor determined Samara's cause of death was homicide due to all the blunt force injuries to the torso, with the multiple blunt force injuries to the head as a contributing cause of the death. He noted there were way too many injuries to be the result of a kid running around and just falling. The injuries to Samara's head were extensive. Multiple contusions on the left side of her forehead, a small abrasion to her left nostril, multiple large contusions on the back of her head that were confluent, meaning they were kind of glued together, multiple contusions to the right side of her face and head, multiple superficial hemorrhages on her brain, and the injuries to her torso were equally devastating. She had multiple marks to her chest and back, a large mark beginning on the left side of her chest and extending onto her back. Her left 10th rib was fractured, unusual for a child this age because children's ribs are more elastic than adults. She had multiple deep lacerations to her liver with a big collection of blood sitting on top of it. Her spleen had been cut as well as her kidneys. Kidneys? What the? I've never heard that before. 2 millimeters of blood pooled in her belly, which was a lot for a child of her age. The doctor also explained the injuries of this severity were most often seen in cases of inflicted trauma and not accidents, because they required a significant amount of force. And when asked about Edward's version of events, that he tripped over a cat down the stairs, the doctor said, no, he's telling porky pies. He concluded this is a non-accidental injury, particularly when you bring in the head trauma, and that can't be accounted by a single fall. Tragically, the doctor testified these injuries would have been extremely painful, and when they asked her if she had medical treatment at that time and not a day later, could it have saved her life, he agreed that it would have been her only opportunity to survive. Now, Edward's trial revealed the full scope of the tragedy. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of child issues resulting in death. While the defense attempted to maintain that Samara's death was accidental, Key witnesses for the defense included Shannon Edwinson and Jonathan Lane, who were recalled to deny being present at Edward's residence. But mainly, the physical evidence, medical testimony, and Edward's own admissions painted a clear picture of what happened. So the jury ultimately acquitted Edward of felony murder and aggravated child abuse. However, they found him guilty of voluntary manslaughter as a lesser included offense of felony murder. The trial court sentenced Edward as standard offender to consecutive terms of 12 years for the aggravated child neglect conviction and 6 years for the voluntary manslaughter, resulting in an effective 18-year sentence. Now, it was said the biological father, Edward Mays, who was in prison at the time, did urge child services to take custody of his daughter and other children. He had tried for 3 weeks while he was in jail to get the DCF to intervene before the child died. He told them, "You need to get my kids." He called them and he wrote a letter. The girl's mother, Jill Smith, had been in jail for 3 weeks, leaving Edward with her 6 children. Edward had spent 6 months behind bars for aggravated assault, burglary, and failure to pay child support. Samara's mother, Jill, was also behind bars for failure to pay child support. For what? The DCF had been under scrutiny for its role in the lives of children who died, including repeated failures to accurately count and keep track of fatalities. The commissioner, Jim Henry, he said that the department has opened an investigation into this fatality and is actively working this case in partnership with law enforcement. Bit late for that, isn't it, Sonny Jim? What's crazy is, how did Edward Mays, I know the Edward name confusing because both parties involved, the 2 men involved, so to speak, how did he know about all the abuse? But the death of 2-year-old Samara represents one of the most heartbreaking failures of the DCF. This was a little girl who should have been safe, who should have been protected, who should have had a chance to grow up and live her life. Instead, she was placed in the care of a man who was using cocaine, drinking heavily, and ultimately took out his frustrations on a defenseless toddler. The evidence suggests Edward injured Samara so severely she sustained injuries comparable to those seen in major car accidents. Perhaps most tragically, Samara's death was entirely preventable. The doctor testified if she had medical attention sooner, she would have had a significant chance to survive. Instead of seeking help for the child, Edward, injured, he spent the night cleaning up evidence and trying to construct an alibi. When he finally brought Samara to her aunt's house the next morning, it was way too late. I still don't think 18 years is good enough, but let's move on to the next story. A man sobbed on camera after being told he wasn't the biological father of his girlfriend's 12-week-old son, whom he was arrested after taking the child's life. Kane Mitchell, who was 31, from Cambridgeshire, was jailed for a minimum of 18 years for the murder of baby Teddy, who died in hospital on November the 11th, 2019, after 10 days on a life support machine. A 4-week trial at Cambridge Crown Court heard that Teddy had suffered injuries consistent with being gripped hard, shaken vigorously, and having his head against a hard surface. Baby Teddy died with 17 broken ribs, fractures to his skull and collarbone, a bleed on the brain with spinal and eye damage. Kane Mitchell had been in a relationship with Teddy's mother, Lucy Smith, who was 30, and he told police he believed he was the baby's father. At 3 p.m. on November the 1st, 2019, the ambulance service was called to Paterson Court, where Teddy was found to be unresponsive and in cardiac arrest. Lucy Smith had left Teddy in the care of Kane that day while she did the morning school run. Detective Inspector Lucy Thompson said of Kane that he is completely devoid of any remorse or empathy, and that's the thing she found really hard. She said it's all about Kane and not what Teddy has been through. The police also spoke about Kane's behavior, and when he was arrested, he was pretending to be a caring father while taken to the hospital with baby Teddy. He said, "I don't effing think so. Oh my god, I would never hurt a baby. I'm not leaving my son." However, officers were able to prove Kane had taken the life of Teddy because of the types of injuries and how they were inflicted. You see, Teddy died as a result of his fractured skull and lack of oxygen to the brain. Medical staff were concerned about how Teddy received his serious injuries, and Kane and Smith, Lucy Smith, were both arrested. Police footage showed the couple being visited by officers in January 2020 after a neighbor reported seeing Kane strangling Lucy. But when officers arrived at the house, Lucy could be heard exclaiming, "Is this a joke? I'm sick of you coming around here." Meanwhile, a teary Lucy separately told another officer that nothing had happened, adding, "It's taking the piss now." The officer told her he could see marks around her neck and asked if that might be why they had been called to the apartment. But she said, "It's probably my tan. He, being Kane, hasn't even touched me. There hasn't been no arguing here." Meanwhile, the officers went on to visit some of the neighbors, many of whom said they'd been left scared of Kane after hearing arguing from the apartment. Police returned to the apartment where they arrested Kane for domestic violence and common assault, but Lucy defended her partner. She said, "You are not arresting him. I'm not staying here tonight on my own. No, he hasn't done anything. You're not taking him anywhere." Meanwhile, Kane exclaimed and began screaming at the police officers, "You ain't got no proof. I ain't done F all. There's nothing on her. If anything, I've got marks on me. This is effing ridiculous." Investigator Lucy Thompson of the Major Crime Unit told the reporters that, "Lucy, we have good, strong evidence to show she is a victim of abuse from Kane, but she's not taking any of the opportunities to acknowledge she is a victim of abuse. It would be quite unusual for us to say, 'You are a victim,' and we know you are a victim." Kane was then brought in for a police interview, with officers questioning the state of his relationship with Lucy.
A bit of pushing on both parts.
But he insisted, "It's very verbal. I don't like having a row or an argument and then sitting down." He said, "I need 10 minutes to reflect and get out and diffuse the situation so it doesn't escalate by her either lunging for me and me having to lunge back," which to me suggests that he has lunged back before. The neighbors told police that it was a violent and volatile relationship. Something has triggered and either he and Lucy flipped, and that's what led to the injuries to Teddy. The officer said they had been through his phone, questioning aggressive messages between the pair. They recited one message exchange in which Kane had questioned why Lucy should be visiting the park with one of their children's friends' parents. The text message said, "Answer me. You don't understand, you idiot. I've swore on my mother's ashes that unless you tell me Ross's second name before you are home, I'm abusing you. Simple. Unless you tell me, I promise you, I'm going to take you into the bedroom and do it. Listen to me, I'm actually going to have to do it." In other words, Lucy met up with a male friend. He got jealous and demanded his name. Kane insisted it was just a threat and that he said, "I would never touch her." What kind of threat is that, you muppet? What else does that suggest? And during the interview, the officer said she wanted to discuss Teddy's biological father. She said, "We have had some DNA profiling back, and the profiling has come back that you are not Teddy's father." He then, during the interview, Kane put his hand to his face as he appeared to cry after the revelation before saying, "I feel sick." "No, bitch, you are sick." Later, police said they had to be very careful with how they had interviewed him because he was on a knife edge of exploding. Meanwhile, Inspector Thompson said she wanted to give Lucy an opportunity to acknowledge she was a victim of domestic violence.
Scared of, and the reason, because you're scared, you are covering for them.
However, when they sat down for an interview together, Lucy insisted she had no explanation as to how Teddy died. Meanwhile, she defended the text message exchange, saying, "Every couple argues." She went on to say there had been a few from her boyfriend over the years, but I don't really see why this matters. She said, "Just because he's going to do something like that doesn't mean he is going to do something to Teddy. The officer then went on, I'm going to ask you a question and look you straight in the eye. Cain has assaulted you on a number of occasions. And while they were having this conversation, Lucy could be seen acknowledging his violence, and she said, with me maybe, but he wouldn't do that to a child. It doesn't mean he would do anything to my children. I know he wouldn't do that because he loved that baby. He honestly loved that baby. I don't see what he did to me, why it matters. And then when officers said Cain wasn't Teddy's biological father, she burst into tears as well. Meanwhile, police went on to conduct an interview with the eldest of Lucy's children who lived with her and Cain. While the child was not identified on camera, their voice could be heard saying, Ugly Cain. I call him ugly because he abuses me and he strikes me on the arm. He basically got hold of my leg and dragged me in there, and my head was on the floor. He was holding my foot and clenching it really hard. And Cain also broke Mummy's mirror and his hand was bleeding, so Mummy ran into our room and shut the door so he couldn't hurt us. She's explaining the incident in the death of baby Teddy. She went on to say, he was trying to hurt us all. It made me feel sad because the glass was on the floor and Mummy stepped on it. After the interview, Investigator Thompson told the camera that Cain had tried to walk into traffic on a motorway. She said, God knows how he actually survived. He's got a fractured pelvis, fractured elbow, fractured ribs, and a hand injury. Now eventually, with all the evidence gathered, Cain was charged with murder. Police then entered the hospital to alert Cain to the change in charges, finding him in a ward after these injuries where he was hit by a car. He could be heard saying, this is absurd, as he was arrested and removed from the hospital in a wheelchair. Investigator Thompson said, when I first met him, he presented you as you would expect from a grieving father. He has changed and showed the ability to change that persona at will, depending on the circumstance he is in. He has been completely devoid of any remorse or real empathy for Teddy. That's the thing I find really hard. It's all about Cain and not about what Teddy has been through. Footage also showed Lucy being asked by detectives how her son suffered such horrific injuries, to which she replied, no idea. She then went on to say she would tell police if there had been any violence toward Teddy. He's my son at the end of the day, and he means more to me than anybody. And it was revealed that social services and Cambridge police had been alerted to concerns from worried neighbours weeks before Teddy died. Now, during the trial at Cambridge Crown Court, the jury heard how Teddy had suffered weeks of neglect and rough handling during his short life at the hands of Cain. A council spokesman said, a serious case review is underway and the findings should be published later this year. We cannot comment further until it's published. Investigator Thompson, who led the investigation, said, this was a tragic and terrible case in which an 11-week-old baby lost his life at the hands of a person who should have been there to protect him. Our year-long investigation found that Teddy had suffered multiple horrific injuries during his short life, which neither Mitchell or Lucy could account for. We hope it will encourage anyone with any concerns for a child welfare to come forward and report it to us without delay. In the trial itself, the jury were read statements from neighbours who said they had heard arguments coming from the address on a regular basis and that the household had been unsettled since Cain moved in. During the police interview, Cain said he believed he was the biological father, but of course it was revealed to him that he was not. Now, Cain himself was sentenced to a minimum of 18 years in jail. Lucy was found not guilty of neglect after she didn't dial 999 for more than half an hour after seeing her child. The judge said the level of force required to inflict these injuries must have been massive and similar to those forces associated with a road traffic accident. So to conclude on what actually happened, right? They got into an argument, he gets into a violent rage, he takes it out onto the child, and the child dies. Cain is a typical example of a man with no purpose. He doesn't have a sense of control. There's no power. So what does he do? He feels control, he feels power over this child. And as a man, we all like a little bit of power, right? We all like to be in control as men, because I believe we're predisposed, right, to want to be in control, to take care of our women, to take care of our family, to take care of our children. You know what I mean? And sometimes, as men, when we don't have this feeling, well, it brings out the worst in us. Well, calling him a man is rather generous. Clearly, this man was a child. Anyway, comment. Tell me what you think.